You're sitting in a plastic chair outside room 4 at a USCIS field office, and the officer just closed your folder without saying approved. Her exact words were, "Your case is still pending, you'll get something in the mail." Your work permit expires in 11 weeks. Your daughter starts kindergarten in the fall, and you were supposed to book a trip to see your mother, who's sick, the moment this was final. Nobody warned you that the interview went fine and "you're approved" are two completely different sentences. So you walk out with a receipt, a half smile from the officer, and a question that's going to sit in your stomach for the next several weeks. Does silence at the interview mean something went wrong? Or is this just how the system works now? Keep that question in mind, because the answer isn't what most people assume, and it changes what you should actually do this week. Here's the part almost nobody explains clearly. A green card interview has exactly 4 possible endings, and denied is only one of them, and it's actually the rarest. The first ending is approval on the spot, where the officer stamps your passport or tells you the card is coming, usually within a few weeks. The second is what's called administrative processing, or a continuance, where the officer needs one more document, one more background check to clear, or a second look from a supervisor. The third is a request for evidence, form-coded, but functionally just a letter asking for something specific, a tax return, a marriage-related document, a corrected form. And you typically get somewhere around 30 to 87 days to respond, depending on the notice, though today most RFEs top out near 60 days. The fourth, and genuinely the least common, is an outright denial, which almost always comes with a reason in writing, and for many categories, a path to appeal or refile. What happened to you at that plastic chair was almost certainly option 2, a continuance. And a continuance is not a verdict, it's a pause button. Think about a composite case a woman will call Renata, married to a U.S. citizen, filing what's called a marriage-based adjustment of status on Form I-485. She and her husband walk into their interview, answer questions about their wedding, their apartment, their joint bank account, and the officer says, "I want to check on something. You'll hear from us." Renata spirals for 3 weeks, assuming the marriage was flagged as fraudulent. In reality, the officer was waiting on an FBI name check to clear, a routine security screening that has nothing to do with the strength of her case and everything to do with how common her husband's name happens to be. 5 weeks later, the approval notice, Form I-797, shows up in the mail, with 0 further contact required. Nothing about her interview was wrong. The system was just doing background work she couldn't see. Now picture an employment-based case. Someone we'll call Daniel, on an H-1B, sponsored by his employer for a green card through the EB-2 category. Years into a process that started with a labor certification, moved through Form I-140, and then sat behind a priority date that had to wait its turn in line before he was even allowed to file his I-485. Daniel's adjustment interview goes smoothly, but the officer tells him they need updated evidence that his job offer is still valid, because enough time has passed since his employer's original filing that USCIS wants current proof the position and salary still exist. This is not a red flag about Daniel. It's a pattern that shows up specifically in employment cases where the process has stretched past a year or two, because the underlying job offer has to still be real on the day of approval, not just real on the day someone filed paperwork years earlier. He gets a request asking for a current pay stub and an employer letter, and here's the twist that surprises most people in his position. The interview itself, the part he spent weeks rehearsing answers for, was almost a formality. The actual bottleneck was a piece of paper his HR department needed to reissue. He sends it back within the deadline printed on the notice, and the case moves again within a matter of weeks. And then there's a case that looks nothing like either of those on paper, but hits the exact same emotional wall. A student, we'll call her Priya, on an F1 visa, adjusting status based on a recent marriage to a U.S. citizen she met during her master's program. Her situation is more sensitive because her F1 status and her work authorization under optional practical training are both time-limited, and she's terrified that a pending green card case means she's suddenly out of status. She isn't. Once you file the I-485, you're generally protected from accruing unlawful presence while it's pending. And if you also filed the I-765 for a combo work card, that document typically keeps you authorized to work even after your OPT clock runs out, as long as the adjustment case stays open. Her interview ends the same way Renata's did, a request for a bit more documentation. In her case, proof that her name change and address updates were consistent across her F1 records, her OPT paperwork, and her marriage certificate. It's paperwork housekeeping, not a verdict on her marriage or her honesty. But Priya doesn't know that yet, and for about 10 days, she genuinely believes she's about to be put in removal proceedings over a mismatched middle initial. So why does this happen so often now? And why does it feel like it's gotten worse in the last few years? Field offices have been dealing with a combination of increased fraud screening, particularly on marriage-based cases, staffing that hasn't kept pace with the volume of filings, and a policy shift that expanded in-person interviews to categories that used to be approved on paper alone. The honest answer is that officers today have more boxes to check per case than they did a decade ago. And a growing share of interviews end in continuance simply because one background check, one database cross-reference, or one supervisor sign-off hasn't cleared yet on interview day. It's bureaucratic sequencing, not suspicion, in the vast majority of these cases. Here's the part that reverses how most people picture the officer sitting across the table from them. In a lot of continuance cases, the officer already believes you. They're not hunting for a reason to say no. They're just not the last person who gets to say yes. Here's where people make expensive mistakes. The first mistake is panicking and hiring someone to fix a case that was never broken, spending money on a new filing or a duplicate motion when all that was needed was patience and a case status check. The second mistake is missing the response deadline on an actual request for evidence because they assumed, wrongly, that silence from USCIS meant they had unlimited time. Miss that window, commonly somewhere in the 30 to 90-day range stated right on the notice, and your case can be denied for abandonment, which is a completely avoidable, self-inflicted wound. The third mistake is booking international travel on the assumption that a pending case is basically approved. It isn't. If you leave the country while your adjustment is pending without the right travel document, a form called advance parole, you can be treated as having abandoned your own application. And Renata's sick mother situation is exactly the kind of story that turns tragic if someone books that flight before checking their paperwork first. The fourth mistake, and this one's sneaky, is not updating your address with USCIS the moment you move. Because that RFE, or that approval notice, goes to whatever address is on file, and a missed notice because of an old address can look, on paper, exactly like a missed deadline. The fifth mistake, and maybe the most common one, is calling the USCIS contact center over and over in the first 2 or 3 weeks, before there's even been time for anything to happen behind the scenes. That doesn't speed anything up, and it eats time you could spend actually preparing documents for the requests that might be coming. So back to that question from the plastic chair. Does the silence mean something's wrong? Here's the actual answer. You can tell the difference between a routine continuance and a genuine problem by watching two things, not by reading tone into an officer's face. First, check your case status through your online USCIS account, which now shows real movement, not just case received. And a status that changes to something like case is being actively reviewed a few weeks after your interview is a normal, healthy sign, while a status that sits completely frozen for several months with zero updates is worth escalating. Second, and this is the one nobody tells you, if you receive nothing in writing within roughly 60 to 90 days of your interview, that's your cue to request your case history or file an inquiry, because a genuinely troubled case tends to go quiet in a way a routine one doesn't, whereas a case that's simply waiting on a background check almost always shows small, boring movement somewhere in that window. Renata's case moved in 5 weeks. Daniel's moved in about 7 once his employer's letter went in. Priya's moved in 6. None of them got a denial. All 3 got exactly what you got outside room 4. A pause, not a punishment. And here's the detail that ties all 3 stories together, the one that actually answers your question for good. In every single one of these cases, the file that eventually got approved was, on interview day, indistinguishable from a file that gets denied. Same folder, same tone from the officer, same unreadable closing line. The only thing that separated them was what happened administratively after everyone left the room, which is precisely why watching your online case status matters more than replaying the interview in your head. If you're in this spot right now, staring at a folder that got closed without the word approved in it, here's what I'd actually tell you to do. Check your online case status today, not next month, and take 5 minutes to screenshot it so you have a time-stamped record of exactly where things stood. If a notice arrives, read the deadline on it the same day it lands and calendar it immediately, because that date, not the interview itself, is the only real emergency in this story. Don't book international travel and don't assume anything about your timeline until you know exactly which of the 4 outcomes you're dealing with. And if you do need to travel for something urgent, look into advance parole before you buy anything non-refundable. Gather the obvious follow-up documents now: tax returns, updated employer letters, proof of address, even if nobody has asked for them yet, so you're not scrambling later inside a 60-day window. And if 90 days pass with total silence and no case status movement, that's when it's worth reaching out for an actual case inquiry, rather than waiting it out quietly and hoping. Most of the fear in this process comes from not knowing which of these 4 doors you walk through, and now you do. If this helped make sense of what just happened to you, subscribe, because next I'm breaking down exactly what to do if that letter turns out to be a real request for evidence, and how to respond to it in a way that doesn't slow your case down even further.